There is a word we use in the church that sometimes strikes fear in people's hearts: theology. I think it's because the writings of prominent theologians over the centuries have been filled with words and phrases like eschatology, ground of being, hermeneutics, method of correlation, Sitzenleben, all these wonderful things that people go, what? Nothing could be further from the truth, though, because theology is actually quite simple. By definition, it's nothing more than the study of religious faith, practice, and experience, especially the study of God and God's relationship to the world, the study of the nature of God. So whenever we read the Bible, and we're doing our best to understand the teachings we find there, we're doing theology. When we tell stories about how we think God has been at work in our lives or the lives of other people, we're doing theology. And it's important for us to do theology. And the reason for that is, well, very basic. Because when we try to seek and understand who God is, we come to a better understanding of who we are. In the book of Genesis, we read, God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them. It's not, of course, to say that we're made physically to look like God, but it means simply this: there is something in us that reflects who God is, something in us that shows people a glimpse of who God is. A 13th century German theologian known as Meister Eckhart said it like this. He said, the seed of God is within us. Now, the seed of a pear tree grows into a pear tree. The seed of a hazel tree grows into a hazel tree. And the seed of God grows into God. He wasn't saying we were going to become God, but what he was saying is that the further we grow in our faith, the more clear people will see and understand who God is. And what is the image of God, though, that we have in our hearts and minds? That's where the difficulty rises. People have as varied an understanding of who and what they think God is as there are people in the world. But there has been some interesting viewpoints about God, I believe, over the centuries. Gerard Hughes was a Scottish Jesuit priest, and I like the way he described one of our more traditional Christian images of God. He put it like this: God was a family relative, much admired by mom and dad, who described him as very loving, a great friend of the family, very powerful, and interested in all of us. And eventually we're taken to visit good old Uncle George. He lives in a formidable mansion. He's bearded, gruff, and threatening. We cannot share our parents' profound admiration for this jewel in the family. And at the end of the visit, Uncle George addresses us. Now listen, dear, he begins, looking very severely. I want you to see you here once a week. And if you fail to come, let me show what's going to happen to you. And then Uncle George leads us down to the mansion's basement. It's dark. It becomes hotter and hotter as we descend, and we begin to hear unearthly screams. In the basement, there are steel doors, and Uncle George opened one. Now look in there, dear. We see a nightmare vision, an array of blazing furnaces with little demons in attendance who hurl into the blaze all those men, women, and children who failed to visit Uncle George once a week or act in a way that he disapproved. And if you don't visit me, dear, this is where you most certainly will go, says Uncle George. He then takes us back upstairs to meet Mom and Dad again. And as we go home, tightly clutching Dad with one hand and Mom with the other, Mom leans over and says, and now don't you love Uncle George with all your heart and soul and mind and strength? And we, loathing the monster, say, yes, I do. Because to say anything else would be to join the queue at the furnace. At a tender age, religious schizophrenia has set in. And we keep telling Uncle George how much we love him, how good he is, and that we want to do only what pleases him. We observe what we're told are his wishes and dare not admit, even to ourselves, that we loathe him. That sounds a little bit over the top. But it is a little strange to be talking about a God of unlimited love and forgiveness, and at the same time talking about a God who seems to have no patience with people for not coming once a week. One of the most famous American preachers and theologians in American history was a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Edwards, a Congregationalist preacher in colonial days. Now, I was especially impressed this morning because Stuart Nelson actually knows this entire speech that I pulled a portion from. The thing about Edwards was he was considered this wonderful theologian, and he had great images of God, but one of the things he was most famous for was a sermon titled, "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." It's considered a classic of early American literature, and this sermon, like many of those in those days, went on for a couple of hours at a time. Bear that in mind. But it could go on for a couple of hours, and people flocked to hear him, to hear things like this. But part of that sermon, while only a small part, was one that I found just ghastly. Because in it, he describes God as someone who is so disgusted with human beings that God is just wants to dangle us over the fires of hell like a small child would hold an insect over a flame. But God loves us. Too often, though, we have been taught images of an angry and vengeful God. And it's easy if we cherry pick portions of the Bible to find things that will support us in that. We've seen plenty of images of God as an angry, vengeful God. I always thought, for the longest time as a young kid, I thought God looked like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. Well, he looked pretty, you gotta admit, I know it was Moses, but still, it was very similar to the pictures of God in the Sistine Chapel or other places. It's always a white-haired, and he had great hair. Who didn't notice he was never balding. He always had great flowing hair, a strong physique, but always a very stern look on his face, and always male, of course. What's most disturbing about that image, though, is that is not exactly what God was teaching to the people. I mean, God, I always believe, especially strongly, that Jesus came to correct so many of our misconceptions of who God was and how God acted in the world. He taught about a God that was different from the gods that were in the civilizations around there, where you, of course, spent all of your time making sacrifices to those gods, because if you didn't please them, they were going to certainly exert their retribution. He taught the people about a God that we see in today's parable of the prodigal son, a God of uncontrolling love. It's easy if we want to concentrate primarily on the end of the parable, and we'll get there, but we shouldn't miss some important points that are there at the very beginning. To begin with, that just wasn't how it worked with inheritances. First of all, a younger son would never have gotten a share, even if his father had died. The inheritance would have passed on to the elder son. Remember the story of Jacob and Esau? It was the elder son that was going to get everything. And so to ask for his inheritance early would have been reason for punishment itself. But the father acts very strangely in this matter. He doesn't get angry, doesn't send him back to the fields. In fact, he doesn't even mention him reacting at all. The father doesn't try and talk him out of it. Doesn't put a guilt trip on him saying, "Oh, fine, you just want to see me dead." No, he just gives him what he wants. And not only that, that in itself would have been scandalous. Because once the word got around the village there, they would have been pretty upset with this father. He would have either been a laughingstock, or they would have chewed him out for letting his younger son get away with something like that, because the next thing you know, all of their younger sons are going to come up asking for things. And I'm fairly sure the older brother had a comment long before the end of the parable about his brother and what he was getting away with. But the father never gives any thought or hesitation according to the parable. Didn't put up any roadblocks. He allowed his son to do exactly what he wanted. He allowed him to exercise free will. I don't know about you, but like things you see on TV and in the movies, I ran away as a little kid. Now I'm talking little. We were living in a suburb of the Twin Cities, And I can't remember for the life of me what it was that I was mad about. Now, my daughter can remember 3 weeks out of the womb and knows everything from her childhood and tells us things we can't imagine how she knows them. And we go, how do you? If I try to remember things from my childhood, there's very few things I can remember, but there's one thing I do remember, and that was I was going to run away because I was mad at Mom and about something. And so I got my little red wagon, and yes, it was a little red wagon, and I loaded it with my stuff, and I went over and helped myself to as many chocolate chip cookies as I could get into a sack because Mama just made a big batch, and after all, if you're on the road, you need sustenance. So I loaded up, the bad part is I probably took about 3/4 of the cookies, loaded them in there, and I just remember going out the door and on my way. And so off I went, grousing and mumbling, eating cookies, lots and lots of cookies. Now, from a kid's point of view, what's a long time is probably not a long time. Nor is a long distance a long distance. But I just remember starting to go uphill, finally, and realizing I'm really tired. And I'm hot, and I'm not sure why I'm complaining. And so I decided to turn around, and I made the long trip back home, but I was a lot more scared going back than I was when I was leaving. Now, as I'm the oldest of 6, Mom was probably at home with anywhere from 2 to 3 infant or toddler children, all sisters. Probably why I really left. But I remember going home thinking, oh boy, I can hardly wait to see what this is going to happen. Mom didn't say a word. Now, of course, in those days, if we were to do that today, the mother would be accused of child abuse because you let the child get out of sight. I know I was a number of blocks away, and we don't do that these days, but back in the good old days, we could get away with that. But I just remember coming home and coming inside, and Mom not saying anything, asked if I was hungry. I could eat. Have any cookies? And not only that, she didn't tell Dad. Probably the thing I appreciated the most. But I just remember feeling so relieved when I got back home and knowing that she wasn't going to hold it over me or she was going to punish me or anything else. Just like moms do, she greeted me and made everything okay. I've always felt this parable of Jesus and the prodigal son to be the defining teaching of who God is in the world. I know that there are plenty of other ones, including the sheep and the goats, and the parable of the talents, where we see an image that shows a God that's upset with us. But as far as showing the love and forgiveness of God, I don't think there's anything that does it better than this one of the prodigal son. And usually when we read this parable, I think we put ourselves mentally in that position of being the prodigal. We like to think, okay, I understand, I've done some things in my life, and yes, it would be nice to think that God could love me and forgive me no matter what. When the reality is, there's probably an equal number of times when we should put ourselves in the position of the elder son. I shared with the men's Bible study on Wednesday morning that I know someone, for instance, that takes great comfort in believing that God is really a lot like Uncle George, because this person feels like they've been mistreated in their lives by a number of different people who have now died, and they never got any kind of retribution in this life. But that person takes great satisfaction and peace thinking they're roasting in hell. There is that part of us that wants to think, at the very least, all those people have done us wrong, which go, and obviously they did things that God wouldn't approve of, that they're paying a price. But is that really the God that Jesus teaches us about? Jesus taught us so many things that were not the traditional way of understanding God. how we view Scripture, how we treat our enemies, how God treats us. But I'm afraid we've taken what Jesus taught the people, picked out those little few verses that we like, added some things that Jesus never taught, and made those into the image of God that we feel most comfortable with ourselves. Because after all, if God is a punishing God, then as creations made in the image of God, we can act that way too, despite what Jesus taught us. If God only forgives him in a limited way, then we can have limits to our forgiveness, despite the fact that Jesus taught us differently. And if God acts that way towards other people, the only problem with that is that also means God might act that way toward us. And so we start to view ourselves as flawed and unworthy. And things like guilt start to overwhelm us, despite what Jesus taught us. In this parable, Jesus showed that, yes, human beings have been given free will by God. God allows us to do what we choose to do. God doesn't stop us from doing things. There are times we wish God would. But that's the thing about really, really loving someone, is that willingness to let them make choices on their own, even if you don't agree with them. That willingness to let someone, you love them so much that you won't try to control them. Jesus says we have the free will to do what we want with our lives, but we also have the free will not only to squander our lives, but to make the right choices. To choose to live into the image of God that he taught about, that idea of being able to forgive and love without limit. We use the phrase grace upon grace as our theme for Lent because we truly believe that that is the God that loves us, one who has grace upon grace, an unlimited amount of love and forgiveness. If you look back at the history of humanity, you have to assume that there has to be an unlimited amount of love and forgiveness, because if God was a controlling God or a God of retribution, then certainly things would have happened a long time ago. But this image that Jesus taught us about is not that way. That's the image we're to live into. Unlimited love, unlimited grace. It's our path to choose, but it makes it so much easier if we recognize, as Meister Eckhart says, the seed of God is within us. The seed of God is within us. And the path of love and forgiveness is the same one that waits for us as waited for the prodigal son, the one that says, come home, and we will rejoice together. Amen.